Hello, viewers, and welcome back to the Jindal School of International Affairs Dialogue Series. I'm Professor Sreeram Chaulia, Dean of the School of International Affairs at Jindal Global University. And in this series, we pick up some of the most salient issues of common concern to all of us in this time of great crisis. Today, I'm privileged to be joined by my dear friend and a very, very distinguished business journalist and think tank head, Ms. Manjeet Kripalani. Manjeet heads the Gateway House think tank in Mumbai, the most dynamic new think tank that we have seen in India and I dare say in Asia in the last 10 years. And she's the founder of Gateway House along with Ambassador Neelam Deo. Manjeet has is an award-winning journalist, has covered politics, business, society, economics at close quarters in the US and here. And she's actually one of the most articulate voices on global issues. Gateway House, the knowledge production that Gateway House has been doing in the last 10 years has been tremendous. A lot of people have ideas to do something new and big in India, but very few people accomplish it and create real institutions that have the momentum of their own and a life of their own. Manjeet is one such dreamer who thought about this for many years and then made it happen in 2009. So that's how we have Gateway House, and I think we are richer for it as a country because the think tank world used to be centered only around National Capital Region of Delhi. But Gateway House is in Mumbai, and over the years has established a place for itself with high quality research and analysis and policy recommendations, both for government and private sector on geoeconomics, geopolitics, and foreign relations. So welcome to the show, Manjeet. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you, Sreeram. That's really a very generous introduction. And I can say the same for you.
Thank you so much. Now, today we have picked up a very weighty subject, globalization, and whether it has reached a sell-by date, and whether we are now looking at a kind of a new era where there will be some new principle on the basis of which the world is going to be organized. And some of this has to do not only with the pandemic and the shocks it has created, but it preceded it. Now, I want viewers to your attention for a few facts I want to state, because globalization we generally define as in a simple and comprehensive way as a free movement of goods, capital, and people across borders. And at least since the fall of the Soviet Union, 1991, for the last 30 years, it has been seen as the guiding principle or the framework on the basis of which most of our lives are ordered. So what happened to free movement of goods, free movement of capital, and free movement of people, especially as a result of Corona and more generally? Let me give you some facts. The World Trade Organization, WTO, is saying that this year, 2020, global trade is not only collapsing, but is going to contract by up to potentially 32%. Unheard of. And you may have all followed the news that Roberto Azevedo, the WTO Director General from Brazil, suddenly resigned in frustration because the multilateral trading agenda was not moving forward. Next, global investment flows. According to UNCTAD, the UN Commission, FDI flows this year could drop by as much as 40%, 40, as the result of the sudden closure of economies caused by the pandemic. Third, international migration. According to the Migration Policy Institute, migration and people's mobility across borders have become dead in their tracks. And we are witnessing the sharpest decline in remittances that migrant workers usually send in recent history. So as of last year, there were still around 250 million migrants worldwide. And now many of them are homebound or waiting to return to the native countries because they've all been rendered jobless. And we don't even know when this whole transnational migration system will again re-emerge, or even if it will. Now, all these three trends, there was already pressure on them before Corona, but Corona seems to have completely given like the coup de grace and has wiped off all the core tenets or the pillars of globalization. But the critique of globalization has been building up over time. I mean, almost 2 decades ago, left-leaning economist Joseph Stiglitz wrote a book called Globalization and Its Discontents. And at that time, it was largely, the criticism of globalization was limited to those on the far left, Marxists and communists and some socialists. And by all means, Stiglitz is a socialist. But now, I mean, 20 years later, or 30 years since globalization started, there's a dark cloud hanging over it, and everyone is taking a shot at it and saying this is not working, this is not working. So Manjeet, what went wrong? Where did we go wrong collectively, and why did globalization fail, so to say, to sustain itself and to keep on winning the confidence of the majority of people around the world?
So Sreeram, I'm going to start with a very funny incident. In 1996, you may recall, your audience will be too young at that time, but Jaswant Singh, who became our foreign minister and our finance minister at that time, the BJP government was in power for about 13 days. While he was, during that time, Jaswant Singh gave a talk at the Madras Chamber of Commerce, and there was the discussion at that time was on globalization. Now, 1996, just remember, it's a long time ago. And I remember him saying, globalization, walking up and down the stage, globalization is like an orbiting globe. And, nobody could understand what he said, and he could not understand what globalization was. And look at this, all these years later, 25 years later, people know what globalization is, and they even know about its death. So I think what happened to globalization, it is an interconnected world. It was a beautiful dream. The developed world began to blossom. They did really well. And then they wanted to connect with everybody. There was this whole dream about the world as one family. Everybody was feeling really nice about themselves, especially because the developed West felt very nice about itself. And they wanted everybody to feel the same way and also to be like them. And you remember that old saying that any country that has the golden arches, i.e. McDonald's, never goes to war with each other. And such was the confirmed sort of vanity of globalization. What has happened since then, globalization over the years became hype. And this interconnectedness, it started with finance, and the financial services began to interconnect. And then you had outsourcing, which was a wave of globalization begun in India, IT outsourcing. And then you had the globalization of products and products manufacture, which is what happened with China. Now, China was welcomed into the WTO in the year 2001. But 15 years prior to it, the US and the Western world decided to bring them in because they wanted this big country to be part of globalization. They weren't getting very far with India because we were still sort of caught up with our own contradictions. And then globalization, they had everything in place. They had their own finance system. They had a country to whom they could experiment with this outsourcing of products. And they had IT outsourcing from India. So everything was going swimmingly until there was a realization that globalization was benefiting two groups of people. One is the 1%, and the second is the People's Republic of China. We actually have an article on our website on this, but when this was realized, then the discontents, as you mentioned, started to emerge. And if you all remember, during the 2016 elections and even before that, there was a movement of the world called the Occupy movement. We are the 99%. And this spread throughout the world, in every park, every central park in the world. And the young people were saying, what about us? Globalization has benefited the 1%, and what about us? And no country was spared this. That whole thing sort of came to a silent end when you had leaders of countries started being elected, which were leaders who were more connected with the ordinary person. Mr. Modi was one of them. Mr. Erdogan in Turkey was one of them. And Donald Trump was one of them. And so when he came into power in 2016, then people started to understand, okay, there's an answer to this runaway globalization, this hype, this dream that we're all one. And everybody thought at that time that we're even going to intermarry and the whole world is going to look like one person. We're all going to have honey-colored skin and kind of mousy brown hair. And luckily that has all come to an end. So the malcontents and discontents have come to the fore. It had been building up for a long time. And then the most globalized outcome of globalization, which is the corona pandemic, then attacked the world. And the mixture of corona and the arrogance of China really blended and created a very, very toxic cocktail. And that's where we are now. That's where we find ourselves now. So globalization is at an end. I don't think the world's interconnectedness. Can you hear me, Sreeram?
Ma'am, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yes. Okay, sorry. So the interconnect, but I can't hear Sreeram.
I'm sure he'll reconnect.
Okay. So so anyway, so these reconnections, now what has happened with COVID is that it has spread around the world. It is going to bring globalization to a halt. And for sure, the people of Republic of China is not going to be the same again. They're not going to be the beneficiaries as they were. And the world is going to have to think of a new way of existing. And in a very strange, odd manner, we're going to have to go back to where we are before. Globalization believed that technology, when it went to its natural end, is what the world would be. All factories would be run by robots, and nobody really thought, well, what's going to happen to the ordinary man? The ordinary man needs a job, he needs to earn a living, and the economy needs to function. And so countries like Japan were okay with robots, but countries like India and clearly the United States are not. And that's where we are at right now. Shira?
Ma'am, actually, sir, actually facing some technical issue, so he will be back in a few minutes. So if you want, you
Should
can
I just
continue,
keep talking? Okay.
Yes, ma'am, please do.
So let's look at the various other elements of globalization and really what happened. What was one of the problems? So one of the problems of globalization, my dear friends in the audience, was an issue called financialization. So while globalization, the interconnectedness of financial systems, the free flow of capital took place, the big banks on Wall Street became so enamored with this free flow that they started to invest for themselves. So instead of investing in the productive economy, for instance, giving loans to automakers, giving loans to housing starts, giving loans to manufacturing companies, they started playing the markets, the stock markets, amongst themselves, and they created this slew of very, very sophisticated and exotic banking instruments that really people could not understand, and certainly the ordinary person could not benefit from or even play. And so they started to lend to themselves, and consequently they ceased to lend to the productive economy, and that also became a compulsion for countries like the US to start exporting to China. It's because they needed to get, the companies just couldn't afford to stay the way they were. Manufacturing was too expensive because banks weren't lending to them. They were just playing with the money by themselves. And then they started outsourcing to China, and that gave them 30% cheaper products and also more profits. And really this whole shift started taking place there. And what you saw was in 2008 was the collapse of Wall Street, what the Americans call the global financial crisis, but it's actually just an Atlantic financial crisis. It was the collapse of the system, which had become so embroiled and enamored of itself that it had tied itself up in knots. And so the financialization of Wall Street led to the lack of productive lending in these economies, led to the outsourcing of China. China became very big, and then the entire global supply chain moved to China because there was simply nothing left at home to do. So the US had a very strong textile industry, and that textile industry simply vanished and went off to China. And so China has now become the center of the world. And I would say that it was a willing move and a very knowing move of all the Western countries, thinking that this could happen and it would all be fine. China would not aspire to be a great power because now it has everything. But China aspired to be a greater power than its parent, which is the United States. And I remember one of my sources said to me many years ago that the US and China are in a deadly embrace with each other. And that deadly embrace is now coming apart. That decoupling of 30 years is now coming apart. So it seems the coronavirus is that it's more than an earthquake. It's what happened to Japan. It's a tsunami, it's an earthquake, and it's a collapse of, of a very toxic system.
Very much so. And Manjeet, my question is then, will this mean more conflict between major powers, and what will that do? Is it, I mean, the Cold War, we had really disastrous military interventions and destabilizations by the Soviet Union and the US in the developing world. You know, there was like it was like a tug of war, and people were being forced to choose sides. And of course, India opted for non-alignment, and we had a bloc to avoid taking sides. But you know, it was a devastating period. So, and global depressions do tend to be correlated with wars. So, I mean, is there a likelihood that as the tensions boil over, initially it is decoupling, could it then lead to, you know, active military clashes and such things? And how can we actually, you know, we cannot afford a war at this time, because if it's a global depression, really we have to focus on the healthcare situation with the virus. We have to focus on the economic recoveries. People are dying, you know, like flies. This is really a very abnormal situation, and we cannot afford more conflict and tension. So are we talking about, and this whole multilateral, you know, mechanisms for diplomacy and negotiation have all broken down? We just mentioned the WTO. The WHO is even more politicized now. So you name an organization, none of these big institutions which were flourishing in the heyday of globalization seem to be working much anymore now. So how can we avoid catastrophe now?
So you're right, absolutely right. These institutions are the institutions that created the first, the waves of globalization. It created an environment. These are the post-Second World War institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions that created an environment of prosperity, which has allowed the West to grow, and therefore, you know, we are where we are now. So the problem, let's do two things. One is the multilateral world. The problem with the multilateral institutions is that they serve their founding masters very well, but they didn't serve the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has been clamoring for their reform, and that reform has simply not come because it has not suited their masters. And what we're seeing now is the collapse of that multilateral system. So instead of listening to what was being said, the needs of the developing world or the rest of the world, the established West chose not to listen. Reform now is absolutely a must. So either right now, we all have to contribute to a reform of these institutions, and it has to be on everybody's agenda ASAP. So in fact, Sreeram, institutions like ours and institutions like yours should be working on this research. What is the reform that really needs to be done for the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, most of all, you know, the Bank of International Settlements, etc. All this while, countries like ours have been able to use these institutions to a small degree and to the best way possible. But now the last crisis, which was 2008, created the G20. It went from the G7, which was an output of the Second World War, to the G20. The G20 is now ours. It is ours to use. It is the most influential economic global body. and it is ours to use to create this change. The good news is that India is going to be the president of the G20, the chair of the G20 in 2022. This means that we can have a full-blown reform agenda for the rest of the world. And like anything else, we have to present it. There will be a little pushback, but eventually we will get to something which will be a real reform of these institutions. So that's one thing. The second thing on is there going to be a war? I think we are already in a war. This is the new kind of war that has taken place. Whether it was released from a lab in Wuhan or not, the fact is that China allowed this to spread. It was known in December when there were Christmas holidays, and it was known in February when the Chinese New Year took place, and yet they allowed their people to travel freely and people to travel internationally in and out, although they had closed their domestic airports and ports completely. So there was that mischief going on, absolutely. And you know how it is, the guy in school, the guy who gets the good marks in school and who's kind of the good sportsman, sort of nice looking, he can also play jokes on the rest of the class, and he does. And this is China's joke, except it's gone horribly wrong. It's gone horribly wrong for the world. There is no way that we can have a traditional war, because it's devastated places like Afghanistan, Syria, etc. And I hope that this will, because it has devastated everybody so equally, I hope that this will show to the rest of the world, particularly the Western countries, that, and the rich oil countries like Saudi Arabia that have been, participating in these global wars, that it's pointless. So there is a ceasefire right now in all global engagements, except in Afghanistan for different reasons, but it is happening. So the conventional war or an unconventional war really will not happen. We know even the terrorists are terrified of COVID. So I don't think that's possible. But there will be now a war which will use intellectual capacity. People are going to think very, very hard about biological warfare, because people are angry and they want to make somebody pay. So biological warfare, all the things that we saw in science fiction will now sort of become a reality. And these are the great unknowns. We don't know what is going to come of it. There will be space warfare. And this is deadly because there aren't that many space countries in the world. But still, there will be that kind of warfare and, spying, data, using data and digitization. That is the biggest form of war that we are going to see, because everybody will know everything about everyone. And so we're in for a period of great uncertainty. Maybe we will overcome COVID, but then we have to put up our defenses and our offenses against new and unknown systems.
Very true. I mean, uncharted waters, and but the example of G20 you gave is interesting, Manjeet, because indeed 2008 crisis generated that. But of course, people now say that the US, at least Obama, pushed to convert the G20 used to pre-exist before the 2008 crisis, but only as a finance minister forum. Obama saw the need for something larger and much beyond the G7 or the UN Security Council, and therefore he used his social capital and brought people around. This time, of course, Trump has his hands full, and he's not that type of leader who can actually create cooperative institutions. So there has been all this talk about how the US is absent and is no longer there in the global governance. So there is no global governance now. It's the G0 world, as Ian Bremmer calls it. So question marks. I mean, my own view is that the regional cooperation can still flourish, and regional around major regional powers. And my last book, Trump, was about that, about how different regions of the world, we don't need a US kind of a sheriff anymore to be able to create cooperation. So hopefully, even if the global governance has broken down, even if globalization is facing a death knell or whatever, I hope that the regional cooperation, and our Prime Minister has been at the forefront both in G20 and also with the SAARC cooperative mechanisms to fight COVID-19. So one would hope that likewise, different regions, we're going to see regional leadership, regional cooperation, small group, because even in trade, they are saying it's now all about small group or plurilateral combination, because the big multilateral thing is over now. big globalization is also over.
And also the issues that used to be considered only India's issues, in these small regional forums, APEC didn't get signed. I mean, RCEP did not get signed because we have an issue with our farmers. But now so does everybody else. The whole world is subsidizing their farmers, and the cloak is off. Everything is transparent, and we know. So I think that there will be more sensitivity to countries' issues because everybody is so laid low that maybe even these regional associations and the regional treaties will be more realistic instead of being so idealistic and perfect, because we are no longer in this perfect world.
Yeah, protectionism, currency war, these kind of things. We saw that after the 2008 crisis, and more barriers are coming up again to the free movements and free flow. So I think at least regionally, we should create regional public goods, and with some vector as a key state, a key state leading it. And in Asia, definitely one would expect India to do that. Although the Chinese have their own claims for hegemony. But coming to China now, Manjeet, we referred to it earlier, but Japan and the US and to some extent some European countries have started thinking about the huge strategic vulnerability they face by putting all their eggs in the Chinese basket with regard to the FDI. China is like a vacuum cleaner, it sucked in all the capital of the world, trillions probably in the last 30 years. And now they are center stage, and look at the vulnerability. I mean, most of the countries that have been worst affected by Corona are forced to import almost all their medical equipment from China. And we have a situation, more than 50–60% of imports of PPE and masks and ventilators, everything is manufactured in China. And that's just only in health sector, medical equipment. Look at the broader, all the fields of economies, everything, the factory of the world became so big that it almost became a monopoly. So now the question is, and many countries are saying, this is it, the Corona is a wake-up call, and we should now disinvest and look at other destinations. To an extent, Trump's trade war had already started that last 3 years, even before Corona. Thailand, Vietnam, to some extent even Bangladesh, had started attracting some of the capital that was moving out of China. But now this is the big question, Manjeet. Prime Minister Modi has called for, awakening the sleeping giant. And he has appealed to all the states across India that, yes, we are in a tremendous economic crisis along with the rest of the world, but there is one ray of hope, which is to attract the massive investment, especially the Western investment that is now suffocated and is also is feeling vulnerable in China. So, I mean, people are all very skeptical. In India, people tend to be skeptical and say, yeah, but we have missed many opportunities. Ease of doing business ranking is improving, but still the FDI, we have to get in a lot more. Manufacturing is not really taken off in India. So, I mean, this seems like a make or break moment to me, Manjeet, because if we miss this bus of the next 2–3 years, when people are going to be wary of China, people are want to be, cutting their stakes in China and looking for better opportunities. Now, are we prepared for it, and what do we need to be doing, domestically, really? Because this process has created a lot of loss and damage and harm, but there could also be some winners. And could we be that, the sleeping giant that awakens, as Prime Minister Modi calls it?
So, Sreeram, the great thing about India is that we are an old civilization and we know how to survive. So whether this opportunity comes or goes, we will still survive. We know how to do that really well. But the truth is that this time, I think you're absolutely right. The elite of India is full of gloom. I mean, these are a bunch of gloomy Gopals. There's no other way, nothing else to talk to them. And part of that reason is because these are that 1%. They have benefited greatly from globalization. They've benefited greatly from the investment that came in. They've got their money. They've got a nice nest egg. They've got everything wherever they want in the world. And now, they are, I mean, they have many genuine complaints, but it's become very fashionable to crib. The ordinary Indian, on the other hand, is a more optimistic person. This Indian has more education than ever before. They now have a decentish home. They have an insurance policy. They usually have some kind of job. They speak a little bit of English. They actually have they have healthcare. They have some form of vehicle, and they have an optimistic outlook on life. And so I think we should put our hope into these ordinary Indians who will then be the entrepreneurs of tomorrow. And COVID has been this marvelous chance when we're seeing this great sweep of migrants going back to their villages. They have, in the old days, you all know about the Kerala migrants. They came back from the Gulf. They had all these ideas. They made Kerala. There is no reason why the migrants going back today can help make their rural homes, but partly because the rural Indian is no longer a country bumpkin. The rural Indian now has a smartphone, and from what I understand is this past 2 months, almost 250 million young Indians who were in school were actually learning online. Many of them just through one smartphone, with one father in the family and 5 children, but they still had an online education. We don't realize that a little change goes a very long way in countries like India, because there is a hunger to change. So I think that India will be a beneficiary at its own time. Some of this money will come to India. There are the usual things that India needs to do. We need very good infrastructure. We need to cut the red tape. I think what drives people crazy is the red tape. And we must not forget that the last 30 years, the world has been used to a single window policy in China. And we don't have that yet, but we hear very good things about Invest India. They've been doing a nice job. So the other little secret of the multinationals in India, particularly, and Indian companies, is that they have all been making a lot of money in India. India is a very profitable place for business. They've been expatriating their profits, and they really don't want anybody else in this nice little game. So companies like Abbott, international companies, they're doing brilliantly in India. They really don't want any competition. So they've seen what it can do in China. It can wipe you out, narrow your profit margins. And the only reason they make good money in China is because the Chinese state subsidizes so much of their investment. But I think that that's a little secret in India. Companies do very well. So we need the optimists to start working on it. We will create our own model. And yes, China is the hegemon. It wants to be that. It intends to be that. But there's no reason that we have to fall into that trap.
Great. So some optimism to go forward. Now, Manjeet, we have some very interesting questions. We have more than 60 in the audience right now, the live show. And I'm going to share with you a few questions, and maybe we can pick up some of these and brainstorm. Now, Sandra Pratap has a question. Ma'am, with the preponderance of the developed nations coming to an end, what do you think of India in a post-COVID era, or India after the end of globalization? In other words, is this the big moment for the global South and for emerging powers? Because everyone has been equally devastated economically, but in terms of our ability to bounce back or to rebuild, it seems like this is a big moment where we can say that the hegemony of the richer countries, by the way, are middle income countries, because China is now cannot be called part of global South anymore. So these countries have all been discredited and seem to have failed. So Manjeet, your thoughts, is this a big moment for the developing world? I mean, you still hear from these global institutions like the World Bank that, Africa needs aid, and South Asia has got so many poor people and they desperately need aid, and we have to give them aid, and they have to be bailed out and all that. But I don't think that's the right picture and the right way to look at things,
Correct.
So the global South, I think we have some dynamism. So far, we have done better than the advanced countries in minimizing losses with the COVID-19. So what do you think? I mean, this is a good question. Is this the moment for the developing countries and collectively all of us, including India?
So Sandra, you put your finger on the pulse, and Sreeram, you read my mind. Yes, the global South and countries like India, again, old civilizations, we are very resilient. That's point number one. The second thing is, as I said, a very little reform goes a long way. And we do have a mass of people, you know, in physics, you have this, you have a large mass of people, the momentum of a large mass of people moving forward can really create dramatic change. So we do have that. We have seen it before, year 2000, when India became the toast of the world. You know, we had a coming out party in the year 2000, and everybody said, wow, look at India changing. And we took a dramatic leap forward. So where we are now is an outcome of that. But yes, the global south, I think that this term developing, I find it really offensive. I think that era has come and gone. There is no country that is developing or developed. It really depends on what you want to be. We know that it's now no longer possible or even necessary for all countries to aspire to be like Sweden, because it's simply not possible. But we can aspire to be like the best in our own class. So Mumbai may be kind of can aspire to be partly Dubai and partly Shanghai, but it's easier for Mombasa to try and be like Mumbai, or even for Mombasa to create its own model. So we have to think about um, our own culture, our own strengths, our own abilities, and really what we want to be. So the question, the whole idea of the developed of the South is going to have to go. These discrepancies and these divisions, I think, will no longer apply. And because globalization, going back to your previous question and comment, because globalization is going to come to an end, what is going to take its place is a lot of localization. And this has become possible because of technology. As we know, even now, 3D printing is going to localize so much. And that's a good thing. So with technology is going to come localization and not globalization. I hope that helps to answer something.
Yeah, you know, this reminds me, Raghuram Rajan's most recent book, Third Pillar, talks about decentralization and about community and how the markets and the states have left behind the community and the grassroots. So market, the very meaning of market, Manjeet, what you're saying, you know, at the level of ideation itself, we think of, you know, stock exchanges and brokers making, you know, deals in billions, but actually the markets are the ones that should employ our informal labor force and, you know, generate, you know, livelihoods for millions of people. So we have to probably go back to basics and build from there. You know, this is the kind of a revolutionary moment we are facing because of Corona, where new ways of organizing the economy have to come up.
That's right. And in fact, I would take it one step behind, or maybe one step further. Sreeram, you're absolutely right about the markets, but may I say that it is the bazaars that we need to rely on. Less than the markets, it is really the bazaars. And that's where all our local strengths lie. And the world used to be a bazaar until it got converted into a market, into a 20th century market. But really, it is the bazaar. And we knew how to trade. There was so much globalization in the past. I mean, we know that just the monsoon winds created globalization between India and Africa. And so we hope see the rise of the bazaar again, rather than the electronic market.
Which was the markets which were skewed in favor of the 1% and in favor of China. We do need to, we won't mind.
We need the bazaar of the 99%. That's right.
Very good. Now, Manjeet, I have another question from Achyut Nair. He says, ma'am, what are your views on China's takeover of HDFC's shares? So one is the disinvestment of capital leaving China and how we can attract it. But the other question is China being on the hunt right now because there are so many of these, you know, failing or whose stock value is losing rapidly and becoming very cheap for quick buys, you know, all these failing companies worldwide. So are we going to see a kind of a takeover bid by China worldwide, you know, taking advantage of the disarray and the collapse of the markets worldwide? I mean, is that a possibility?
Well, I think that has already happened in large part. I think China has been doing that for a very, very, very long time. And as you know, our government reversed the policy that any investment in FDI and in FII and FDI really was going to have to go through government permission. And in fact, it was some of the research done by Gateway House on investments, Chinese investments in India, that we realized so much of it was just in our startup sector. And again, going back to our gloomy gusses and our cribbing classes, these are the people, do you know, Sreeram, they're apart from really two people, Mohandas Pai and Mr. Ratan Tata, there are no big individual investors in Indian startups. And so these young startups, which is our young youth, people in your audience, are having to go to Chinese companies because nobody is giving them money at home. We are instead funding startups abroad, which is fine, but China funds its own startups, and we have a lot to learn from China because they know how to work in a market of billions, right? They've got the same kind of numbers. But we really need our own people to start investing in these startups. And the government of India has several schemes, but you know, unless the private sector comes in with its strength and its ability to be able to understand markets and capital, how much money to give, the government can only do so much. They can only encourage, but then you need the private guys to come in with their knowledge and their excitement and their ability to network. You know, they can put together a young startup in space with a startup in, you know, agriculture. They know what to do with that. So we need to, it's a good thing that China has been sort of stopped in its tracks. And as we know, the United States has an entity called CFIUS. They've got a council that looks at investments in the US. And this is now actively stopping Chinese investments in US stock markets, because all the Chinese companies that were, particularly the startups and the technology startups, used to immediately go and list in the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, and that is now going to come to an end, and the US has already moved to stop it. So I think the world is wise to China's investments, and those who are not wise, well, China is going to keep trying and acquiring them, and these are maybe the smaller companies and countries that don't really have that much of a that much strength or their own investors at home. I think the EU, which has really not performed very well just now through the COVID crisis, I think this is where the EU can come in and help its companies, especially in the former Soviet bloc, where China finds these companies extremely valuable because they're full of technology, science, all kinds of military applications. These are really countries with rich intellectual capacity and research capacity. And so the EU should really be watching that very carefully. So, and Africa, again, you know, rich, they've got lots and lots of young people who are coming up with ideas that work for Africa. South America, with its enormous mineral wealth. So China is going to be all over the place. We really have to watch our backs. And it's doing what anybody else would do. Any company or country with an opportunity will do exactly what China is doing. So we can't blame them, but we have to watch our backs.
Yeah, so this vulture preying upon decaying or weakening corporates worldwide is something to be watched out. And yes, I think the role of the state, like you're saying, the state has to step in and actually prohibit and bar some of these takeovers. In a way, it's less easy to do takeovers today than it was in the heyday of globalization, because now the role of the state has come to the fore. So hopefully in the sovereignty matters, because people are saying sovereignty matters, right? That's one of the reasons why the globalization has become so discredited, because people said, what happened to sovereignty and our own, nation states? They were being made to disappear in this fuzzy, universal thing called global markets. So Manjeet, there is another interesting question from Nitin Arya. And do you think the world, and this is very interesting, think about it. Do you think the world is now descending into a new kind of an iron curtain with the USA, its European allies, India, South Korea, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Australia, New Zealand, all on one side, and China, Russia, some parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Iran, Turkey, and some Southeast Asian countries on the other? Wow, that's some lineup. But it's like a big, football match with 11 countries or 11 on each side. But is there some kind of a division? So this going back to the original question about the new Cold War and all that. I mean, is there a broad division? Can we say two camps? Or I think that's an oversimplification.
Yeah, I don't think you can say two camps. I don't think the world is that simple anymore. I don't think it's that easy to divide the world anymore. What China has done, China's version of globalization, which is really its Belt and Road, investing in weak countries, making nice with its corrupt dictators. Everybody is now wise to that, and I don't think that countries are going to be that easily swayed to say, you're with us or against us. That era is over. Countries, this is going to be an era of self-interest, and countries are going to be multi-aligned around the world. So I don't believe that there's going to be an iron curtain. I think that Saudi Arabia is going to have to be nice to Iran after all. Iran is one of those, old civilization that has learned to survive. And even though it's been hit for so many decades, it is still doing very well. They have a lot to offer. So we need to start actually bringing these countries back into the Committee of Nations. And I believe that there will be a softening of the US stance on Iran after COVID. I mean, the world has changed completely, Sreeram, COVID. And so there will be a reassessment of taking sides. I don't believe that there's going to be too much of taking sides, because people know what has happened when you take sides. So I don't believe there's going to be an iron curtain. There will be just the world will retreat into itself. It'll nurse itself, heal its wounds, and then come out and try and make friends old and new again. But at the moment, I think for the next 2 years, everyone's just going to be inward looking and trying to make friends by themselves.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, our attentions must be focused on saving lives right now, rather than geopolitical, brinkmanship. Hopefully, now there is a question, Manjeet, about by Raymond Bhaka, and the question is: the clarity of the recent failures of the IMF, the World Bank, and WHO has been exposed. So, how do world leaders come on consensus with reforms and making these institutions? So, in the absence of these institutions or their failure, what kind of reforms? I mean, already Manjeet has mentioned G20, but it looks like, so the question is, the formal institutions, most of them seems to have disappointed and not fulfill the aspirations of the people of the world. Because remember, all these UN agencies were created in the name of we the people of the United Nations. So 7 billion people.
That's right.
Clearly are frustrated and angry. So what kind of, in the absence of these institutions, how do we still do reforms? Because generally we think in terms of reforms through some negotiated processes, in formal institutions like a UN setting and all that. But now those are broken down. So the question is, how do we still do reforms?
That's
At the
right.
individual.
So Raymond, I think that, yeah. So Raymond, I think that because these institutions have failed much of the world for so long, already countries like China have started their own institutions. So the BRICS grouping started the New Development Bank, to do its own lending. It's the sort of our version of the IMF. And then China has also started its own version of the IMF called the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, whose goal is simply infrastructure. That is China's goal, but everybody is benefiting. As you all know, India has been the biggest beneficiary of loans from the AIIB. And India is also the second largest shareholder. We were the minute China set up that bank, we jumped right on, which was a very wise thing to do. So I think we will see a lot of new institutions being created. Some will be created by India, some will be created by Africa. I think there are some very good African institutions. The African Union will start, I think, playing a more important role. They also have very rich experiences to share with us. So we will see some of those institutions coming to the fore. I think the World Bank, the UN, etc., these have started to live for themselves. These have become like the banks that stopped lending to the productive economy and started lending to themselves. So they have become immersed in themselves and their own lives. And I would even put the consultants in this place. Consultants like McKinsey and PwC, etc. They have also started now getting into the business of development and policy making, etc. That's not their job. They do it because actually there's a gap. So I would say to all these young people in the audience, really this is your chance to now start thinking creatively and intellectually creatively about institution building. This is a great moment for India and all our vast experience to start building and creating new institutions, forcing the reform of the old ones in a way that matters to us. And I'll tell you a little story. When Mr. Vajpayee became the Prime Minister of India, the Indonesia also became sort of a democratic country, and was the president. And her first trip outside Indonesia when she became the head was to visit Mr. Vajpayee, and she came to him and she said, I want to sit at your feet and learn, because India is the receptacle of democratic institutions. You have diversity, you have democracy, you've got so many competing voices, and yet you are able to manage this. So teach me. Indonesia has some of this, so please teach me, how do you manage this diversity of voices and this democracy of this multiple democracy that takes place in your country? So within our own world, there is a recognition of our various strengths. We have to now start thinking of those strengths, and I urge you, my young audience, to really think very hard about that. You have a chance to remake the world in your image. Please go out and do it.
Well said, Manjeet. In fact, coming from Manjeet, it means more, because she's herself, as I said at the introduction, an institution builder. So you need the vision, you need persistence, and of course you need new ideas and out of the box thinking. Okay, moving on. We have only 7 minutes to go, but I have a question from Smriti Nair, and Smriti is asking, Roosevelt said it was important for powerful countries to ensure policing. Will the system break down in the post-COVID world, as US agendas have already shifted to deglobalization? So, in other words, the old question the Western liberals are, keep on asking this. Trump has abandoned the, global policeman role, and there's no replacement. There's going to be anarchy. I mean, one of the classic Western liberal views I was just reading, and the audience should also have a look. Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, wrote an essay recently in Foreign Affairs saying it's neither going to be a Pax Americana nor a Pax Sinica anymore after COVID-19. It's going to be chaos and anarchy. Now, this view has been promoted a lot by Western liberal, internationalists for many decades, and Trump has, in a way, smashed that view in the last 3 years. That America is indispensable. Without America, there will be chaos, and the jungle grows back. As the defenders of the US, the world is like a big bad jungle out there, and we were mowing and gardening and maintaining it stably, and now we have abandoned it, so it's going to go to dogs. But I don't think so. I think, Smriti, we are very capable, each of us in our respective regions, to do this policing, quote unquote. We want the regional cooperation mechanisms to work. I don't think we are heading in that direction, and this relates to the earlier question also with Manjeet answered about division of the world into two camps. I think when we say multipolar world, there are not going to be two camps. Let there be 7 or 8 camps, and each managing its own affairs. So globalization, maybe, I mean, like the idea of there being a system manager, as Joseph Nye used to call it, the whole global system, and America is the manager of the whole system. That is long gone. So, but we should not be saying that what comes after is pure chaos or anarchy, or the jungle growing back, because the ability to cooperate and to form small groups and to sort out our own problems, it goes back to Manjeet's point about local. Let's look at local and regional now, much more than global. So Manjeet, last few minutes we have. Smriti's question, you want to take a shot at it? In the absence of America being a global policeman, are we going to head towards anarchy?
So Smriti, I can reassure you, we are not going to head towards anarchy. when you have people like Kevin Rudd, etc., saying that's going to be chaos, actually they have a lot to lose themselves. So let them lose it, because their loss is our gain. And this is a remarkable opportunity for all of us to really rethink the world as it is currently, and also think about it in the future, because we are, you talked about a war. We are at a very critical time. So technology is going to take us into a completely different era, and data is going to take us into a completely different era. COVID has just accelerated all that and intensified it into one very tight, painful spot. We have to try and extrapolate from that, understand where it's taking us. The world doesn't need a policeman. I think the US also took it upon itself to be the world's policeman, because they had a lot of military equipment. They liked messing in the affairs of other states. It was fun for them. They had a huge intelligence community, many PhDs in there. And so this is what happened when a country is very rich and very intelligent, and they can play games. And China, unfortunately, has tried to make itself in the US image. China simply wants to be America, and bigger and more, and they want to take over America. And the good news is that countries like India really just want to keep for themselves. And on that very good, in some ways, we are more, even though we are not an individualistic society, we're an individualistic society where people belong to each other. So our father's brother is not just our uncle; he is our chacha. We have a special relationship with our various relatives. So we're a individualistic society where everybody belongs to each other. It is now time to bring our own elements and tenets and the way we view ourselves together into saying there is only going to be one person or the second person and they're going to rule. No, it's what Sreeram said. With all of us together, there will be many multiple centers, many clusters of excellence, and I believe that the world will actually be a different place. It will just be a different place, and one more suited, I think, to this time.
Very well said. Well, let me conclude by saying that globalization is probably, at least the way we knew it, is not going to carry on, because of all the multiple discontents we discussed today. But the question really is, what kind of world order is emerging? And Manjeet has invited especially young people in the audience to think about building new institutions. So that is the historic task for all of us here. And I remember reading an essay by Robert Lighthizer, the US Trade representative, who's very hawkish. And he says that, the era of outsourcing is over. Capital, big capital, which had been, as they say, voting with its feet, moving around freely, this 1% that Manjeet referred to, they had they maximized the benefits of globalization for so long, and he says that we are going to rein them in now. So if the originator, the procreator of globalization is now no longer for it, what future does globalization have? At least not the globalization that we saw in the last 30 years, not in that form, but perhaps something new, something based on human health and solidarity and human development, because now these questions have come to the fore with the corona crisis. So we've had a wide-ranging discussion, and I think we should watch this again and again to get a sense of the different lines of arguments we have drawn out, Manjeet and I, for people to think about the future. It's not all necessarily negative or bad. There's a lot of bad news coming our way in the coming months and years, because this is a depression. But then there are, always out of the crisis, something new emerges. And that remains our great hope, and we should work towards it. And I invite, especially as Manjeet did, all young people, young thinkers, budding intellectuals, to come up with new ideas. Connect with us at Jindal School of International Affairs, connect with Gateway House in Mumbai, and let's take this forward. Thank you, Manjeet. Thank you so much to the audience. Thank you all. This has been a fantastic discussion, and we'll see you again. Bye.
Thanks. Thank you, Sreeram.
Thank you, sir.
हो गया?
Thank you so much. That was really great.
Have we stopped the recording?